Hello, everyone. This is the first video in a series in which I will be covering some of the many subfields within psychology. Psychology is really vast and wide, and there's a lot of disciplines that fall within it, and they aren't all super clearly defined and distinguished. So my goal with these videos is for you to get a better understanding of some of the basics of some of these different subfields. I like to look at this as kind of like a puzzle, and each of these different domains, which we're going to be covering over the course of these videos, are just different pieces of the puzzle. That puzzle being the human mind and behavior and emotion and all the things that make us us. They don't exist in a vacuum. They all come together to explain people. So, for example, I assume most of you have heard of the idea of nature versus nurture before. Let's take the example of fear of snakes. A lot of people have a very intense fear of snakes, and there's research that certain parts of the brain, the amygdala, as well as increased releases of certain neurochemicals like serotonin, all can explain that. But there's also explanations that say certain experiences can lead to your development. Falling into a pit of snakes when you're a kid would probably do that. There's also evolutionary reasons for it. Some theories say that our eyes learned how to differentiate snakes from other things in our environment in order to detect threats to our survival. Now, I wouldn't say that any of these explanations negate one another. And if anything, they actually can complement each other really nicely. Part of my goal with these videos is to break down some of the dogmatism within science. And dogmatism is this idea of being really stuck into your belief system and thinking that your way of seeing things is correct. Now, in part, this is important for scientists because they need to be able to get laser focused in on a topic, but it starts to ignore other explanations for things. So the point of these videos is not for y'all to leave with a deep understanding of really any of these disciplines within psychology. What I want for you to get out of these is an understanding that all of these disciplines come together to explain people. And sometimes they look at the same concept from a different angle. Sometimes they have completely distinct interpretations. And really, for each of these disciplines, I want you to take away the main question that it's trying to answer. So for this first video, I'm going to cover the disciplines of psychology that are more biological and more brain-based. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about evolutionary psychology, biopsychology, comparative psychology, and cognitive psychology. I'm going to cap this off by talking about quantitative psychology, which is a big part of how we actually make our analyses reliable. Let's start out by talking about evolutionary psychology. To do that, let's think about what's meant by the term evolution. So evolution can be defined as the process by which a genetic material of a population changes over time, resulting in a new species, trait, or alterations to genes. So to put that simply, it's a natural process in how living things adapt over time. Now, these adaptations are typically done with two basic goals in mind: survival and reproduction. And if you take only one thing away from this section, it should be that. Now, this isn't a biology class, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about how evolution works, but I'm going to give you some background here. So evolution as a concept was formally brought into scientific understanding in the mid-19th century by English scientist Charles Darwin. Now, Darwin spent time observing animals, and he collected his observations and drew some conclusions that all centered around one common theme. The surrounding environment is going to shape the course of life, no matter what. No ifs, ands, or buts. Darwin noted that the animals had to adapt to their environment. For example, he would look at birds in the Galapagos Islands, and he found that birds of the same species that lived predominantly on different islands within that chain of islands would have slightly different beaks to one another, depending on which island they spent most of their time on. He determined that that was most likely for the birds specific to that island to be best attuned at being able to get food whatever food was most readily available to them where they lived. Now, these types of adaptations to the environment have led to some terms that have entered popular language: natural selection and survival of the fittest. Now, these are both referring to the same concept, the idea that the traits that are best suited to the environment are going to be the ones that are the most enduring. Now, Darwin himself did not come up with the term survival of the fittest. That was actually another English scientist named Herbert Spencer, who was actually writing a book in response to Darwin's book. Kind of like he took a scientific sample of what Darwin did, like you would take a sampling in music and make a new track out of an old one. And you can see a lot of examples across the entire animal kingdom that really show the preference of certain traits over others. Peacocks developing the big, bright feathers they have to attract mates. The ones that had the biggest, brightest feathers are the ones that lasted because they were able to reproduce more readily. Okay, so where do people come in now? Well, evolutionary psychology takes psychology, reminder, that's the scientific study of the mind and behavior, and it looks at it through the lens of evolution. So how are our minds and behaviors helping us survive and reproduce? And what are the implications of the human history of evolution for the design of the human mind? So what was it like, the fact that we lived as hunter-gatherers at one point? What is that meaning for us now? Well, evolutionary psychology combines multiple fields of study to answer questions like that. It pulls from social psychology, which looks at how human groups interact with one another. It looks at anthropology, which studies historical records of human civilizations. And it looks at biology, the science of the body. And that's just a few examples. I'm going to highlight two major theories that have come about through the work of evolutionary psychologists now. There's a lot more, but these are just the two I've picked for this video. First, the behavioral immune system is a theory that was developed by American psychologist Mark Schaller, and it describes the tendency to avoid disease. So part of surviving means reducing your exposure to things that can kill you. Because of this, we're hardwired to avoid pathogens. So that's anything like bacteria, viruses, germs, etc. This theory argues that our behavior is largely influenced by this drive to avoid pathogens. There's reasons why we're disgusted by things like rotting food, dirty toilets, animals that carry diseases. Now, this theory actually goes a step further, and it argues that that type of avoidance is actually playing out on a person-to-person level. Some studies of the behavioral immune system have linked prejudice against different groups of people that have come from different places of origin to yourself. Some studies of the behavioral immune system have linked prejudice against groups of people that come from different places to concerns about disease. So in other words, immigrants or anyone that's not from your country or your group that you belong to. Now, that group can be a racial group, it can be a socioeconomic group. There's a lot of variation within that. There's a deeply held fear of the unknown in our evolutionary past because what we don't know could potentially threaten our survival. This theory argues that when we don't know people, we're more likely to see them as dirty, as carrying diseases and germs. And that's just our own bodies trying to protect ourselves. It's our immune system kicking in a way that it's trying to protect itself. Now, this research is deeply complicated and very nuanced. I'm only giving you the briefest of introduction here. And if you're interested, we will talk more about this. Another theory from evolutionary psychology is the snake detection hypothesis. Now, I already talked about this a little bit earlier, but I'm going to expand on it here. This theory was developed by American anthropologist Lynn Isbell, and the idea is that due to the threat to our survival that snakes have and still can represent, this theory argues that the visual system of primates, so that's monkeys and us, was largely influenced by the ability to notice snakes. So take this example here. Can you see the snake in this picture? I'll give you a few seconds to look for it. Have you seen it yet? Well, here it is. Not that easy. And some of you might have noticed it. And with more time, I'm sure more of you would have noticed it too. But the fact of the matter is, it's hard to see things like a snake in the grass. And our eyes are trained to notice details like that. And this theory argues that that actually influenced the way that the cells in our eyes developed. And we'll talk more about the eye in more detail later during the semester. And there's actually been multiple studies that have found that when you show participants blurred images of animals, the more you clear them up and the more they get visible, both humans and monkeys are able to identify snakes a lot more quickly than they can identify any other type of animal. Now, evolutionary psychology does have quite a lot of controversy within its findings. If our behaviors are driven purely by evolutionary motives, this can lead to a lot of different interpretations. Issues regarding sexuality, gender, social hierarchy, and more can all take on an evolutionary lens, leading to personal, political, and societal disagreements and arguments. So it's important to note with this field and really any scientific finding that you should take things at face value. Scientists will try to report things only what they literally found within their experiment. When we extrapolate patterns from research and from data, that can lead to beliefs that lack nuance and are potentially leading to problems. So next, let's talk about biopsychology here. So what is biopsychology? Well, at its core, it's the study of how the brain and the nervous system influences our psychology, our thoughts, behaviors, and feelings. Now, this subfield of psychology has a few different names. People might call it biological psychology, psychobiology, biopsychology, behavioral neuroscience, and more. It merges these two disciplines of biology and psychology to explore the complex interactions between our physical bodies and our mental states. Now, I want to note here, it's not the same thing as neuroscience. Psychology and neuroscience are really correlated and they're really interrelated and they have a lot of overlap, but they are distinct areas of study. So why should we care about this field? Well, everything that we do, every thought, every emotion, every movement boils down to the activity in the brain and the nervous system. Now, I'm absolutely not saying that our brain and our biology explains everything about us. Far from it. But all of the things that we do have a mechanism through which they happen. So understanding the inner workings of the body and the brain can give us some critical insights into behavior and mental processes. And whether that's understanding why we feel anxious in some situations, or how our memories are formed and how we can remember things down the line. So the field of biopsychology has its roots in ancient philosophy, and there's way too much to cover here. It would be courses upon courses worth of content. But it really began to take shape as a scientific discipline around the 18th century. One of the most significant early contributions came from French physician Paul Broca, who, in working with a patient, discovered that damage to a specific area of the brain, which we now call Broca's area, impaired speech production. This was one of the first clear examples of how specific brain regions are tied to specific functioning, which is one of the core foundational concepts within biopsychology. Now, biopsychology helps us understand how physical changes in the brain relate to psychological experiences. Anytime you hear someone say that this altered my brain chemistry, well, let's talk about that brain chemistry. Our brains send signals through chemicals called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemicals in the brain that basically transmit signals from one cell to another. These brain cells are called neurons. Now, neurotransmitters include things that you've probably heard of before, like serotonin and dopamine, and they play important roles in regulating our mood, our motivation, our cognition, our movement, basically everything. And when the levels of these chemicals break away from what they are normally meant to be at, that can lead to various psychological disorders like depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, etc. We'll talk more about these neurotransmitters in detail later in the course. Also, biopsychology provides insight into how our nervous system responds to external stimuli. So, for example, when you touch a hot stove, it's the cells in our finger that get transmitted through our spine, which is part of our central nervous system, and they send that pain signal to your brain, which triggers a muscle reflex to pull your hand away from that hot stove. Now, that interaction between sensory input from the world and motor output from the brain is a basic but fundamental aspect of how our bodies interact with the world, and it is one of the key concepts within biopsychology. To study biopsychology, we use a variety of methods, so I'm going to highlight two of those here. Have you ever heard anyone say something like, the brain region was activated upon exposure to this stimulus, or when we fall in love, this brain region gets activated? Well, claims like that can be made usually using what's called fMRI, which stands for functional magnetic resonance imaging. Now, fMRI uses an MRI machine, which is essentially a giant magnet in a tube that takes a lot of pictures of your brain really quickly. The way it works is when someone gets into a scanner, they're usually given some sort of psychological task to do. So whenever we're doing something or thinking something, blood goes to the part of the brain that is most needed for that activity. What the fMRI is doing, what it is literally capturing, are pictures of the movement of the oxygen atoms within our blood to the parts of the brain that are being used in that moment. So this provides a lot of insight into which parts of the brain are being used at different times for different activities. And this provides some really incredible images and some insights into the brain. But it's not actually telling us what's happening behind the scenes. It's only telling us which parts of the brain are being used where. And we then, after the fact, can apply psychological phenomenon to those findings. This is just something to keep in mind when you're interpreting fMRI or really any scientific results. They're not the whole picture. Another method is EEG, which stands for electroencephalography. This is a way to measure electrical activity in the brain. The way our neurons work is by using electrical signals to send those neurotransmitters to each other. Now, EEG is specifically measuring electrical activity in a part of the brain called the cortex. This is basically the very top layer of our brains. It's literally just the outermost part. Now, it's capturing electrical signals from that part of the brain because it's really hard to determine where these signals are coming from. The voltage of these electrical signals are so tiny that it becomes impossible to distinguish individual charges. And the deeper you go in the brain, the less discernible they get from each other. Biopsychology is fascinating in the sense that it allows us to understand a lot of the inner workings of the human mind from the core base elements of the actual hardware that we're working with. However, like with all disciplines within psychology, it's not the whole picture. And quite often, people can get very deterministic with their biology. And things like genetic predispositions to disease can lead people to. Now, one of the problems with this can be the deterministic nature that biological psychology sometimes takes. If our genes and our brains are set up in a certain way, well, who's to say we're not to blame for anything we do? Maybe that's just how we are. Well, I'd argue that that's not the case. And I would say the more you look into these different fields of psychology, you might see the same thing. Next, let's take a look at cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology is the study of our mental processes. That's everything that's going on in our brains. So that's our perceptions of the world. That's our memories, our thoughts, our attention, our languages, our problem solving. It's how we learn things. In essence, it's how we know, think, remember, and communicate. So that's pretty important. It's literally everything that we do. Whether you're solving a math problem, trying to remember what's on your grocery list when you left it at home, or even daydreaming, that's all cognitive psychology at work. And by understanding these mental processes, we can gain some crucial insights into how people learn, how they make decisions, and how to improve mental functioning. Cognitive psychology as a field really began to take shape in the 1950s and 1960s. Up till that point, a lot of psychology was focused on behavior, but around that time, more researchers were thinking about what's going on behind the scenes, what's going on in the brain that we can't see, but is still driving our behaviors. Some of the early experiments within cognitive psychology looked at things as simple as how much information can we hold in our brain at any given time. If I asked you to remember the numbers 5, 9, 2, 3, you probably could. If I asked you to remember the numbers 9, 7, 2, 1, 6, 5, 4, 3, 9, 5, 2, 1, 8, 7, 9, 2, that'd be a lot harder for you to repeat back to me. Well, psychologist George Miller found that people generally can remember about 7 things plus or minus 2 at any given time. So a range from 5 to 9, but generally averaging out at 7 things. That was one of the key early findings in cognitive psychology, and it goes a lot further than that. So I'm going to break down just a few of the key areas within cognitive psych. One of those areas is our perception, the process in how we interpret sensory information from the environment. Cognitive psychology studies how we can do things like recognize patterns in the world, like faces or objects. We have brain regions that are specific for noticing faces out in the world. The fusiform face area is what lets us see things like this as looking like a face. Our perception lets us look at an object and make a quick determination of it. And you can even look at things and hold that image in your head, even if you're no longer looking at it. If I tell you to think of a chair, you're thinking of a chair. Whether you're thinking of an image or the word chair, that's going to be on an individual basis, but you're able to do something with that. Your mind is able to create something from the sensory input of hearing me tell you, look at a chair. Another central focus of cognitive psychology is our memory. So researchers are really interested in studying how memories are actually created in the brain. We call that encoding, how we store them, how we actually put them in our brain, and then how do we retrieve them in the future? How do we remember things? How can we do things like remember a childhood memory, something that happened years and years ago? The study of memory ranges from anything like our short-term memory, which, by the way, side note here, people have the phrase short-term memory wrong. Short-term memory within research is not, oh, I forgot something that I heard yesterday. Short-term memory specifically refers to memory of anything within the last 30 seconds. After that, a memory has been stored in the brain and it is now long-term memory. So the start of my sentence, my previous sentence, if you remember that, that is long-term memory now. That is no longer short-term memory. Another field within cognitive psychology is looking at our attention. How do we apply our mental resources to specific information and ignore other information? Cognitive psychologists study what happens when our attention is divided, like trying to study while listening to music, or how we manage to stay focused on a task for an extended period of time. Research looking at substance use disorders like alcohol addiction have found that attentional resources are changed under addiction. People who suffer from addiction have an easier time applying their attention to drug-related cues than they do to really anything else. Another key area of cognitive psych is looking at our ability to problem solve and make decisions. Another area within cognitive psychology is understanding our decision making. How do we actually choose between things? Do we go off of gut instincts? Are we using previous information and past experiences? Decision making is something that can be applied to a variety of fields, and it has a lot of overlap with fields like economics. Behavioral economics is an entire subfield of decision-making psychology blended with economic theory. Now, some of the challenges within cognitive psychology are that it can be really hard for people to accurately represent what they're thinking. A lot of the tasks that are designed to measure processes like attention or decision making have to be very precise and very specific to get at that one individual process. Our cognition doesn't exist in a vacuum. We're constantly interacting with sensory input, and our cognition replies to that. So, to study it, you have to get really nitty gritty with those specifics. Next, let's talk about comparative psychology. This is the field that looks at differences and similarities across different species. So it's all about understanding how animals, including humans, behave and how those behaviors have evolved over time. The goal of this field is to understand some of the underlying principles of behavior by comparing and contrasting different species. So it is very related and similar to evolutionary psychology. There's a reason I put these two in the same video. So why is this important? Well, by studying animals, we can gain insights to the biological and evolutionary roots of behavior. This not only helps us understand animal behavior, which has its own utility, but different aspects of human behavior, given our shared evolutionary history with other species. I'm not going to bore you and talk about Charles Darwin again, but I will say that a lot of the fundamental theories within comparative psych do come from his original work. Instead, I'm going to talk about a different study conducted by psychologists Rosenzweig and Bennett. Those are their last names. I've never known their first names. This was done sometime in the 70s, I forget when. But what they did was they took rodents, they took rats, and they put them into different cages. On some of the cages, they gave them lots of things to do. Enrichment. They gave them wheels, they gave them food, they gave them, well, all the rats got food, I'll take that back. But they gave them things to play with, they gave them stuff to do. The other rats had really boring cages with nothing in them. They found that over time, the rats with enrichment in their cages had more development in their brains than the rats who lived in the boring, sad cages. So here we're looking at a combination of comparative psychology and neuroscience to understand this idea that, hey, it's probably better for people to have things to do when they're developing. Otherwise, you might end up with a less developed brain. Well, I said people. In this case, it was rats. But that's why it's comparative. Comparative psychology also uses a lot of animal studies to understand similarities and differences in species. For example, Austrian zoologist Konrad Lorenz studied the behavior of imprinting in birds. He found that birds will stick to usually their parents, but they'll stick to someone really early on in their development. He had birds imprint to himself and they would follow him around like he was their parent. Understanding things like that can help us understand within human beings attachments and how babies learn to be attached to their parents or to other caregivers. Comparative psychology can also be helpful for understanding animals within their own worlds. A lot of the work from this field has helped trainers of dogs, horses, whales, dolphins, really lots of animals understand the species that they're working with. And they're able to understand a lot of the nuances of their behaviors. Now, of course, anytime you are working with animals, there are a lot of ethical challenges there. For starters, just the question of should research be done on animals at all is one that continues to rage within the scientific community. I can say personally, as someone who has conducted animal research, it can be really difficult to know that the animals you're working with won't survive at the end. The last field I want to touch on here is quantitative psychology. Now, this discipline, it might not be as widely known as the others, but it is absolutely crucial to the field of psychology. Now, quantitative psychology focuses on the development and application of mathematical models, statistical techniques, and research methodologies for understanding basically everything we're doing. And please don't leave yet. I know it's boring. I said math models, and that's not what you're here for, but really in simple terms, it's just using the numbers and data to study the mind and behavior. So a lot of the concepts we're studying within psychology are really abstract. Intelligence, personality, emotions, None of those things literally exist in the world. Like this water bottle literally exists, but the concept like IQ, that has no physical manifestation. So if we want to be able to really understand these concepts, we need to have really strong, robust statistical models in order to be able to do anything, really. Otherwise, we're not able to test our theories and validate our assessments and validate that our findings actually mean anything. So this field can be traced back to the 1800s. It's a common theme across a lot of these today. One of the earliest people working here was a man named Sir Francis Galton, who was a cousin of Charles Darwin. He was one of the first people to apply statistical methods to study human differences. He looked at concepts like correlation. As one thing goes up, another one goes up too, or maybe as one thing goes up, another thing goes down. That's now a fundamental concept, not just in psychology and statistics, but just something that people understand quite inherently. Quantitative psychology lets us do things like psychometrics, which is how we design, administer, and interpret psychological tests. Anytime we're studying anything like intelligence or personality, really whatever it is, we need to know that, hey, are these tests actually measuring what they're supposed to be measuring? And are they doing it well? These concepts are called validity and reliability. And there are so many really boring books you can read about them if you're interested. I kid. Well, no, I don't kid. They are boring, but they're important. They also let us do things like create statistical models. We can't collect data from every single person in the world. So really, there's no way to know that this finding applies to everyone. But what models allow us to do is take our data and then make predictions about future data. These tests can be used to assess cognitive abilities, and they're often used to predict future success, either academically or in a job. Now, whether or not you agree that that's the way it should be done, the fact that it is done that way means that the accuracy and the fairness of these tests is really important. We want to make sure that they're actually doing what they say they're doing, that they're actually measuring what we want them to measure. Okay, so that was a review of evolutionary psychology, biopsychology, cognitive psychology, comparative psychology, and quantitative psychology. I hope from this video you've taken away a basic understanding of what some of these subfields of psychology are trying to measure. And in the next video, I'm going to be talking about different facets of our development and our role in the social world. Thanks for listening, everybody.